So, welcome everyone. I'm very happy to see quite a few familiar people joining, a couple of new people as well. So, as we have a few new people with us today, let's do a brief recap of what we discussed over the past 2 weeks. So, in our first week, we looked at the wisdom of the Upanishads, which was really a very brief look at some of the central themes of the Upanishads as they relate to theosophy. We we sort of established the idea that all ancient cultures have their own versions of theosophy, that theosophy manifests itself in a variety of forms and through a variety of languages. It's the nature of language that it is imperfect. Language is the imperfect attempt of humankind to capture abstract ideas in concretized form. So it's just the way our minds work, the way we have evolved to think and to categorize and structure things in our environment. We like to take an idea that essentially exists beyond words. And Plato had all sorts to say about this, the Greek philosopher Plato. But we try to take these ideas that exist independent of language and independent of form, and we try to encapsulate them in form and encapsulate them in words. And that's why we have such distinct philosophies as those of the Upanishads and the Egyptian mysteries and the Grecian mystery schools. These are all just simply attempts of different cultures to categorize and understand the workings of the cosmos, the natural order of things. And so in the last week's session, we had a look at the Egyptian mysteries, which relate to quite some extent to today's topic as well. And there was some overlap between ancient Greece and ancient Egypt, some quite notable overlaps, such as the conquest of Alexander the Great, the founding of the city of Alexandria, and the well-known Library of Alexandria. And obviously some of the Grecian mystery schools did migrate to Egypt, and much of the wisdom of the Greeks originated from Egypt, and beyond that from India, and beyond that from Atlantis. So we have this kind of progression of these teachings being passed down from one culture to another, but simultaneously they are spreading to other cultures. So it's not simply a linear progression. We can't say first the teachings were given to India, secondly they were given to Egypt, thirdly they were given to Greece. There is a bit of a messy overlap as well. So at the same time that these teachings are being taught and expounded in India and Egypt, we see them spreading to other parts of the world, spreading to parts of Africa, spreading to parts of the Middle East, spreading to parts of the Mediterranean. So there's this overlap, there's this pattern of teachings being handed down, partly in an orderly form, and secondly in a much messier way in which they're just spreading as ideas naturally do. And I think there's this sort of occult motto, if you like, that when the student is ready, the teacher appears. And I think when we take the Hermetic axiom, as above, so below, we can apply that to this idea as well. It happens culturally. When the culture is ready, the ideas appear, or when the culture is ready, the teacher appears. And so ancient Greece is a fascinating period in human history, and I'm sure everyone here has learned something about it, whether in school or from independent research. So I'm just going to share my screen with you now so we can look at the PowerPoint slides and get started. Okay. So hopefully everyone is seeing my screen. Let's just check. There we go, it should be working now. All right, so the topic for today, the mystery schools of ancient Greece. So we have 4 main objectives in today's class. Firstly, we're going to be looking at the background and context, and we will examine the mystery schools of ancient Greece in the context of Greek religion and mythology. Obviously, we won't have time to go into all aspects of this, so we will focus in particular on one myth one particular myth, which I think encapsulates many of these ideas. Secondly, we'll also do a bit of a comparative study where we will look at the similarities and differences between the initiatory rites of the mystery schools, as well as their esoteric significances to those of other ancient cultures, such as the aforementioned Indian and Egyptian cultures, and modern theosophy. We'll also identify some of these key themes and attempt to decipher or interpret their esoteric meanings. We'll think, well, there's a lot of mythology which can be rather abstract or difficult to pinpoint the particular meaning. Why do people write down or pass down these stories? Why were they so significant to the culture? And why do they remain to be significant in academic study today? And we'll be able to understand that a little bit if we look at the central themes behind the stories. Fourthly, we'll look at the purpose and relevance. So why were these mysteries taking place, these mystery schools and ritual dramas and so on? Why did they bother? Why did this happen? How did it actually help to pass along the ageless wisdom? And also we'll examine the process of initiation in the light of theosophy. So with those 4 central objectives, let's continue on. So just for the benefit of a few of the new people joining us today, by means of brief introduction, my name is Luke Ironside. I'm a student of Theosophy and a member of the Pranava Lodge of the Theosophical Society in the Philippines. I have been involved with the Theosophical Society in various capacities. At the moment, most of my work is taking place online. I'm doing some volunteer work for the online School of Theosophy, as well as some virtual lectures and study groups, both with the Pranava Lodge and other lodges, such as the one that we are all taking part in today. So I will give you my email address also at the end on the last slide at the conclusion. So if you do have any questions about anything that we covered today, please don't hesitate to ask. So ancient Greece is often considered to be the cornerstone of the Western world, from which foundation the various arts and sciences come forth. So we often see it as this sort of fount from which all the various sciences, various arts, drama, and so on, all these come forth from ancient Greece. But this is true maybe to an extent, but I wouldn't say it's the end all, because from a deeper analysis, we can actually see that the wisdom of the Greeks was inherited from the pre-Vedic Indians via the mysteries of Egypt. And again, there's a bit of an overlap. It's not a clear passing down. There is some sharing of ideas in the contemporary times, as well as a linear passing down. There's a bit of both going on. And it represents one facet of the ancient wisdom known to all cultures and civilizations since time immemorial. This having been transmitted both orally and in the scriptures of the great religions. Certain elements being revealed at those particular times and places in the history of humankind that are best suited to the spiritual evolution of the race. And so I think that point is also important, that it's not random when we consider the time frame here. When certain cultures and civilizations receive this wisdom and sort of rise to the forefront in terms of development and spiritual insight, this is not a merely random occurrence. There is a process. There's a teleological reasoning behind this. And those who have studied theosophy in one form or another will have heard something about the masters of wisdom, or those great custodians of the ancient wisdom who guide and steer the transmission of these teachings at particular times throughout human history. So each of these cultures that we're examining inherited this fantastic body of wisdom at a particular time when they would have such an impact on the transmission of these teachings so as to advance humankind. So it's quite a wonderful idea. Everyone can appreciate the spectacular breadth of knowledge that each of these cultures have. But when you put it into that context and you realize why they have this knowledge and the mission, the sacred duty that they have been given in terms of bringing forward the human race, I think it only makes it more spectacular and grander to one's conception. So to continue on, the mysteries of ancient Greece really represent the last archaic relics of the ageless wisdom that were enacted under the guidance of the great initiates prior to the falling of the spiritual and intellectual veil over the breadth of Europe that occurred with the Dark Ages that coincided with the triumph of Christianity. So we see here this period in the early eras of the Common Era. We see this period where the great pagan schools of thought collapsed. There was first this perhaps period of corruption before their eventual persecution and collapse. And when we see the consolidation of certain Christian doctrines, more in their exoteric rather than the esoteric form, with the Council of Nicaea and the conversion of the Emperor Constantine. So we see all of this coincides with the fall of the mystery schools and the period known to history as the Dark Ages, which is, when you think about it, a very appropriate term, esoterically as well as exoterically. This was a time when not much was written down in terms of literature, when certain cultures and great philosophic ideas were forgotten for some 1,000 years. At the same time, we see the esoteric teachings that were expounded in the great mystery schools being forgotten, being pushed underground, the initiates going into hiding to some extent. And so we see this all coincides with the rigid dogmatism, the rise of dogmatism. Of course, Christianity in itself is an esoteric doctrine, but however, the version of it, or the certain aspects of it that rose here and triumphed over the paganism that preceded Christianity, were simply the dogmatic forms used for political reasons, essentially. The esoteric ideas of Christianity very much agree with the esoteric ideas of the Greeks, the Greek philosophers and the Egyptian priests and so on. There is no disagreement there. And if we had more time, I'd love to go into Christian mysticism and Christian esotericism, as that's a fascinating subject as well. And you'll find many theosophical writers have discussed the esoteric aspects of Christianity. So it's not to say that that Christianity as a philosophy, as a religion coming forward, was the negative aspect here. It was the political aspects, the taking Christianity and turning this great philosophy into something dogmatic and political. That was the issue, and that happens to all religions and all cultures and at all times. And so it was from the hallowed crypts of those archaic academies that emerged forth the secret doctrines of the cosmos and mankind. For the Greek initiates placed few limitations upon the scope of their inquiries into the hidden aspects of nature. And they thirsted for the nectar of Theosophia, that's Greek for divine wisdom, that they understood could only be glimpsed through a journey inward to the deep caverns of the inner self. So in the Grecian mysteries, we have this sort of idea of, the mystery schools and the caves in which their sacred initiations would take place. Well, the cave itself is symbolic of the journey inwards. An initiation is only effective when it is an inner transformation. The outer ceremony is simply for the benefit of symbolic representation of something that is actually an inner process. We will go into the nature and purpose of initiation a little bit more further on in the class. So much of what we know about the little we know about the mystery schools of ancient Greece come from a variety of sources. Some of them somewhat friendly, some of them somewhat less friendly, because many of these were given to us by the Christian writers of the time, some of which were not quite so positive in their perspectives towards the schools. And then we also have some writings from initiates of the school, such as Plato, the great philosopher Plato. So first of all, let's look at what Clement of Alexandria, Bishop Clement of Alexandria, had to say. Obviously, he lived in Egypt, but Alexandria was essentially a Greek city founded by Alexander the Great. So according to Clement of Alexandria, who wrote in some depth, albeit not very sympathetically, on the subject, the entire scheme of cosmic evolution was imparted to the initiates of the greater mysteries. For in them was shown to the initiated nature and all things as they are. So essentially, it's looking at nature and finding the root of nature as it is, rather than nature as it is attempted to be understood through the limitations of the mind. The great Stoic philosopher Epictetus emphasized the moral aspect of these teachings and the necessity for proper preparation for initiation through the amendment of the lower nature. While Plato postulated that the chief aim of the mysteries was to lead us back to the principles from which we descended. A perfect enjoyment of the intellectual, here really meaning spiritual, good. So we see that the mysteries have a variety of purposes and aspects, and I think really the most important part is the transformative aspect. The idea that the lower nature would be amended, would be changed and transformed into something higher. And you might have pieced together here a bit of a connection or a similarity to alchemy, where the base metal is transmuted into the gold of spirit. And here it's the same idea, isn't it? We can see clearly that the alchemists borrowed this idea, or inherited, we should more properly say, inherited this idea from the mystery schools of Greece. And we also find these ideas clearly put forward in the schools of Egypt and the philosophies of India and so on. And so we see that initiation essentially is a process whereby the lower nature is transformed into something higher. And so the introduction of the mysteries into Greece was traced by Herodotus to Orpheus, the son of Apollo, who received from his father his golden lyre. So Orpheus is a sort of semi-mythical creature, semi-mythical character, I should say, in Greek mythology. His lyre, being seven-stringed, represented the seven spheres of heaven, and likewise the sevenfold mystery of initiation. While commonly considered a mythological figure, the historicity of Orpheus is considered by the English Neoplatonist Thomas Taylor in his Mystical Initiations or Hymns of Orpheus, where he states, "This alone may be depended upon, from general assent, that there formerly lived a person named Orpheus, who was the founder of theology among the Greeks, the first of prophets and the prince of poets, who taught the Greeks their sacred rites and mysteries, and from whose wisdom the divine muse of Homer and the sublime theology of Pythagoras and Plato flowed." So for those here not familiar with Thomas Taylor, I would recommend looking him up. He was a wonderful Neoplatonic scholar who wrote in quite some depth on these subjects, on the Orphic mysteries, but also on other aspects of the mystery schools and the Neoplatonic school that would emerge later on. So he did do a work called the Mystical Initiations or Hymns of Orpheus, which examined some of the central ideas found in the Orphic mysteries. So I think we can see here that certain scholars do consider Orpheus to be a historical, or at least semi-historical figure, a sort of philosopher, but more than that, a philosopher prophet, if you like, who passed on these teachings and who and who sort of revealed these sacred rites and mysteries to the Greek people. And we can see here a clear passing on from Orpheus to Homer and to Pythagoras and to Plato. So all these great writers and philosophers and teachers of the wisdom who would come later. We can also consider Orpheus from a theosophical perspective. And theosophically, he may be regarded as, or Orpheus may be regarded as a generic title used by the masters of wisdom as they revealed themselves to the ancient Greeks. This title being passed from teacher to pupil over untold generations. So perhaps it was rather than a name of one individual, perhaps it was more of a title meaning something along the lines of Mahatma or great teacher or master, someone who would pass along this wisdom and who had some kind of connection to higher sources, who was more in tune with the workings of the cosmos and the secrets therein. But I think we could also make a clear identification then between Orpheus and Arjuna of Hindu scripture, the latter who likewise traversed the world in his promulgation of the mysteries to the corners of the earth. So for those here not quite familiar, we didn't have time to talk about Arjuna in our section in our first week because we really focused on the Upanishads and only briefly mentioned the Bhagavad Gita. But I'm sure many here are familiar nonetheless with the Bhagavad Gita. Bhagavad Gita is probably the best known of Hindu scriptures, and though it's rather late in its composition, it contains in many ways the essence of Vedanta. Arjuna is a prince, and Krishna approaches him on the battlefield to give him some of the wisdom teachings. And so we see a bit of a connection there between the two of them. And Blavatsky also had plenty to say about Orpheus, and you can find a lot of that in some of it in Isis Unveiled, also some of it in The Secret Doctrine and the Collected Writings. She did refer to Orpheus at quite some length. But she was certainly of the opinion that Orpheus was not merely a mythical god, but rather a historical person. And we can gather that from the following quotation from the 5th volume of her collected writings. A secret language, common to all schools of occult science, once prevailed throughout the world. Hence Orpheus learnt letters in the course of his initiation. He is identified with Indra. According to Herodotus, he brought the art of writing from India. So we have this identification with an Indian deity as well. Again, we have this idea, perhaps in Herodotus's statement, that Orpheus brought the art of writing from India. Well, writing is also somewhat symbolic. We usually see the myths or stories or legends surrounding the birth of writing or the transmission of writing from one culture to another. We could definitely draw a connection between writing and logos, or the word. There's a strong connection between those terms. And perhaps here we see the bringing the art of writing. It's in many ways bringing the philosophy, bringing the secret teachings or ageless wisdom from India to Greece. So I think we could definitely draw a connection between those themes. And we also see that there was a secret language common to all schools of occult science. So before the separation of languages, there was sort of a primordial language that was used by the initiates of all schools. I think that's also a very interesting fact that HPB mentions here. So as we did in our previous couple of classes, I think it would be really helpful to have a look at cosmogony and to relate that the cosmogony of the Orphic system of thought to that of the Egyptians and that which is put forward in the Upanishads. So in our last 2 weeks, we looked quite a lot at cosmogony, didn't we? Which was a very interesting look. And we were able to clearly make some connections between the Egyptians and the Indians. So I think we'll also be able to make some clear connections here in the Orphic system. So essentially, the Orphic cosmogony begins with a boundless principle, the ineffable, thrice unknown darkness, by which epithet Orpheus describes the one existence at the core of the universe. From this principle, all things originated, and while it may be personified through the various gods and myths, it remains essentially indescribable and unknowable, beyond the range and reach of human conception. Issuing forth from this original principle are the progeny of lesser principles that constitute the primordial builders of the cosmos, from the nebula to the atom. The day and night of Brahma of the Hindu cosmogony have their clear reflection in the Orphic system, where at the dusk of the great year of the universe, Kronos, the god of time, reassumes dominion of the primeval darkness. Thus transpires the Mahapralaya, in which the cosmos with its many worlds slumber for 7 eternities. So those who are familiar with the first volume of the Secret Doctrine, Cosmogenesis, will definitely draw some connections here between the Orphic system and the cosmogony presented there. So we see it begins with this principle, which is essentially unknown. Perhaps we could consider it God in the highest conception. In Sanskrit, para-Brahman, that which is beyond Brahman, the absolute. And so this is, Blavatsky speaks of this as an unknowable, boundless principle. And it's pointless to speculate upon it because it transcends the reach of human thought. And so we see from this, though, we have the various grades of differentiation coming forth from the Logos and from the builders of the cosmos. And we see this is represented in the Orphic cosmogony by the gods, by the various gods. And so this would be in Sanskrit a period of Manvantara. And then we find this conception of the great year of the universe. So the great year of the universe, this is essentially the Maha Manvantara, the great Manvantara or great period of manifestation. And as we do have a few new people with us today, just to recap what we talked about in our former sessions. When we're talking about these terms, Manvantara and Pralaya, these are Sanskrit terms which are commonly used in Theosophical teachings. Manvantara essentially means a period of wakefulness, or in simple terms, manifestation. This is the period we are in now, a period of life and manifestation and existence. It is analogous to the period of being awake or being alive. Then we have the opposite Pralaya, which is the period of non-manifestation, the period of sleep or non-existence. And so we see here the statement that at the dusk of the great year of the universe, at the dusk of the Maha Manvantara, the god of time, Kronos, the great Titan, reassumes dominion of the primeval darkness. So he is recrowned king of the darkness. And then it transpires the Mahapralaya, the great period of sleep. So we often find this theme of a struggle, right? And here's the to some extent one interpretation of that primordial battle between good and evil, or darkness and light. However, this is an exoteric take on something which is essentially esoteric. So we have this idea in all religions and in all mythologies, these great battles of the gods, right? The battles of the powers that be. And we see in these battles a somewhat symbolic representation of the natural cycles. And so Pralaya, there's nothing wrong with Pralaya. Pralaya is not itself evil. It is dark, but then as we mentioned in other classes, darkness in the Theosophic conception is not something to be feared. It is not something to shy away from or to reject. Darkness is simply one side of light, one aspect of light. without darkness, there can be no light. They are the two sides of one principle. They are the perpetual equilibrium of the universe, without which nothing could be in existence. There would be no order. There would be simply chaos. So it is necessary to have these two. But sometimes in exoteric mythology, if simply for the purpose of transmitting these stories through mythology, sometimes we personify darkness through some evil deity or evil being. But I also think it's very significant that Kronos is the god of time. It shows the sort of the relative finality, to use a bit of a paradox there, the relative finality of time on it to the manifest world. It feels final, and it is final to an extent. It is final to our finite consciousness, isn't it? Time restricts us. We always using sort of in common parlance, we say things like time is short, or I'm running out of time, or I never have enough time in the day. Time is always against us to an extent, isn't it? And I think we see there why we can see there the significance of time when we apply it to Kronos, to the god of time, as the king, if you like, of Pralaya, the king of the primeval darkness. All right, so I think that gives you a bit of a very brief overview of the Orphic cosmogony. I don't want to go into too much detail because the point of this class is to give you a bit of a basic overview, and then you can, if a part of this really interests you, then I can send you more resources and you can go into some self-study on the subject. So it's more just an overview rather than an in-depth look at any one of these themes that we're discussing today. And so we see that reincarnation was very central to the in the Upanishadic literature, and obviously it continues to be very relevant to the Hindu worldview. We also saw that the Egyptians had a clear belief in rebirth and reincarnation, and many of their myths dealt with this theme, and it was very central to their understanding of the world. We also find reincarnation in the Orphic system. And so Orpheus taught the doctrine of reincarnation and posited that human souls, in their essence, are divine, eternal, and aspire towards freedom, but are caught in a grievous circle of metempsychosis, it's just a fancy word for reincarnation, in which the body fetters the soul as a prisoner to the physical plane. And so this clearly echoes the Eastern doctrine of samsara, the cyclicity of all life, in which souls must periodically return to Earth. And in doing so, they continue their process of spiritual evolution. So that is clearly expounded in Buddhism, but we also find it very much in Hinduism, this idea of cyclic returns. We have death and then rebirth, and there's a point of this. It's not just random. The point of returning, the point of this reincarnation is to continue evolving, continue developing, and over time we will develop into higher and higher forms, spiritually and physically. And so it's also worth noting, I think, that in Theosophy, when we use this term evolution for any newcomers here, this extends beyond the Darwinian sense. Certainly, the Darwinian sense is part of our understanding of evolution, physically considered, but the Darwinian conception is incomplete, if you like. It's a partial picture. So when we talk about evolution in Theosophy, we consider evolution as continuing along two lines. There's the physical evolution, well known to us all from our school education and so on, and our common understanding of the world and history and our origins. And then there is also the spiritual aspect of evolution. We also evolve on a spiritual level. And in fact, when we consider the sevenfold constitution that we mentioned in our previous class, the sevenfold nature of the human being, we could say that we evolve on all 7 planes of existence. All of our aspects of being are gradually evolving. And so evolution is a little more complex in the Theosophical conception. So I just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page there. So really, that's the purpose of reincarnation, is to assist us in gathering experience and help us to face new challenges and new experiences. Sometimes challenge can be oftentimes challenge can be a good thing, can't it? And also, it's for the repayment of karmic debts. We all have our karma, whether this is more on the positive or negative side, and it all needs to be repaid at one time or another. And a lifetime is not enough time for this to be repaid in its entirety. So we have this opportunity through countless reincarnations to repay our karmic debt. And so the Orphic mysteries involved an enactment of the myth of Bacchus, the god Bacchus, interpreted by Plutarch as a sacred narrative concerning reincarnation. According to this mythic cycle, Bacchus dies each winter, only to be reborn in the spring. To the initiates of these mysteries, the cyclical revival, along with the seasonal renewal of life upon the earth, exemplified the doctrine of reincarnation and the transience of death. So I think that's also a really interesting idea in Theosophy and in the various forms of the ageless wisdom that we are considering here. This idea of the transience of death. We usually think of life as being rather transient. We say life is short, life is fleeting. There's never enough time in life, and so we have this idea, or also this rather incorrect idea, you only live once. So all of these ideas sort of express the transience or temporality of life. And yes, life is temporary, sort of, especially in terms of our personal or individual existence. But life considered in the overall conception is eternal, isn't it, in terms of the one life? So it depends what consideration of life we are taking. Are we taking life in the individual sense or life in the total sense? When we consider life in the total sense, it is eternal and immortal, and it is death that is transient. It is death that is simply a transition period before a return to life. So these are all some really fascinating ideas, aren't they? And we'll see how this idea of reincarnation agrees with the Theosophical conception. And so the time between incarnations is also referenced in commentaries on the mysteries, this time frame being in agreement with the Theosophical conception. In their letters to A.P. Sinnett, one of the early Theosophists and contemporaries of H.P. Blavatsky, the Masters K.H. and the Master M stated that the usual time between incarnations is approximately 1,000 to 1,500 years. However, this does depend on various factors, but we don't need to go into that. Now, just generally speaking, 1,000 to 1,500 years. That's very interesting when we consider how it correlates with Virgil's statement in the 6th book of the Aeneid, where he states, all these souls, after they have passed away 1,000 years, are summoned by the divine ones in great array to the Lethean river. In this way, they become forgetful of the former earth life and revisit the vaulted realms of the world, willing to return again into living bodies. So the Lethean river here referred to, it's a mythological river in which, where upon entering, the human being forgets everything that happened in his life, in his former life. So it's obviously just a symbolic statement of the after-death processes, and how after death, with the stripping away of the lower principles and the transition of the monad to Devachan, we find a forgetting of the former life once lived, and then a return to earth anew as a new human being. Same in terms of the eternal nature, the real self, the higher ego, but different in terms of the lower principles and the the personal mind. All right, and so it's interesting. I think it's very interesting to see how these agree. So continuing on, we'll now examine a few of these mystery schools and their origins. And so the mystery schools of Greece originated in Samothrace. This is an island in the North Aegean Sea. This was first inhabited by the Pelasgians, who were themselves of Atlanto-Aryan origin, according to the Theosophical literature on the matter. And they first migrated to Greece before gradually settling the various islands in the surrounding regions. Of all the various mystery schools that existed in the archaic Grecian past, the most famous and enduring of these was the Eleusinian. This was located in the hamlet of Eleusis, from which it gained its name. And this was not very far from Athens, the well-known Athens. And here we have an artistic representation of the Eleusinian mysteries. You will find many representations of this in art, sort of captured the intellectual and artistic mind of Europe during the Renaissance. And so the mysteries are divided into two sections, which is also very significant, I think. One deals with the lesser mysteries and the other with the greater. The rites and ceremonies of the lesser mysteries were held in an inland town called Agrae, where following a probationary period, the neophytes, called Mystae, would undergo their initiation. The greater were held at Eleusis. Those who were initiated into those mysteries were known as the Epopte. So we see these two complementary schools of thought, the lesser or outer mysteries and the greater or inner mysteries. And so the first really is simply a preparation, a necessary preparation for the second. And here again, we have an artistic representation. I believe this is from the illustrated history of Freemasonry. And we see that Freemasonry draws strongly in its symbolism and in its rites from the rites of the ancient Egyptians. And as we mentioned in previous classes, Freemasonry can certainly be considered esoterically as a continuation of the ageless wisdom teachings. So I think it would be helpful to consider some of the objectives of the mysteries. Again, we need to think about why these took place and how they were helpful to the aspirants after spiritual knowledge. So really they had a number of objectives which coincided in large part with the philosophic schools of India and Egypt. In their psychological aspects, the mysteries dealt with the nature of the soul and how it relates to the physical body. Further, how the soul may be redeemed, how the physical body may be redeemed and purified, as was emphasized by Epictetus and Plato, that sort of amendment of the lower self. The purpose of the lesser mysteries was to illustrate to the neophyte, through the means of dramatic performances and ceremonies, the nature and limitations of the unredeemed soul, still bound in the tangled web of the lower self. So I think we can build a foundation here by understanding the primordial differentiation between the lower self and the higher self. And there we sort of see that the lesser mysteries in many ways are preparation for the lower self, the amendment of the lower self. And then we have the greater mysteries, which deal more with things of a higher nature, with the higher self, the nature of the soul. So it's an interesting categorization which this was split into. So we will look at one very interesting ritual performance. And so one ritual performance that was immortalized in myth is that of Ceres and, Demeter in the Greek, Demeter and Persephone. In Latin, that's Ceres and Proserpine. So you might hear both names being referred to, in which the soul is shown to experience a form of death in becoming encapsulated in the physical body. And so we mentioned previously the myth of Bacchus, the annual death and rebirth of Bacchus. And I think you'll find in an examination of mythology from any culture, the theme of the dying and the dying god who is then subsequently reborn, and this applies to goddesses as well as to gods. But it's a central theme in all the great traditions, and the most common or the most well-known example of this myth is in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, of course, in the Christian tradition, which clearly parallels these other traditions. And there have been some excellent scholars and Egyptologists that have drawn some connections between the Christian story and those of ancient Egypt, for example, and hinted that perhaps this was adapted or inherited from previous Egyptian myths, which is very interesting. And this also exists very clearly in many, many forms in the Grecian tradition. We only have time to look at one in depth today, but if you do a bit of research into it, or if you write to me, I can provide some references to many other myths which also followed the same process. So as there were various schools of thought and different mystery schools in Greece, each with sort of slight cultural differences, perhaps regional preferences for different deities, like we find in India and in Egypt also. There may be some regional preferences for different deities who perform the same or similar functions. So because of this, we sometimes find different gods essentially going through the same stories or enacting the same stories. It's essentially, if you strip away the names and perhaps the locations and some of the forms, you find these underlying themes that are identical, and they're just reconstructed using different characters. Okay, so this is a very common theme, very commonly used across a wide variety of cultures and religions, even in the Christian tradition. So Demeter and Persephone, I think most people here probably know this myth or have some familiarity with it. And so Plotinus stated about this: it is death to the soul to be wholly immersed in a body and wholly subjected to it. So I wanted to bring that quote to your attention, like one more time. It is death to the soul to be wholly immersed in a body and wholly subjected to it, because I want to draw an analogy here between Persephone's descent to the underworld and the soul's descent into matter, okay, and the theme of death and rebirth in that sense. So sometimes in this interpretation, we see the soul's death occurs in, esoterically speaking, the soul's death occurs in the period of life, right? And its encapsulation in matter. So when we talk about the death of the soul, esoterically speaking, perhaps what we can understand this as is this period of life, this period of our human perception or finite perception of life is to the soul death, and death to the soul is life. So we see this sort of reversal of the common understanding of terms, which is very much encapsulated in this myth of Demeter and Persephone. And so first, let's consider what HPB had to say about Demeter. HPB called Demeter esoterically the productive principle in the all-pervading spirit that quickens every germ in the material universe. Okay, so we see esoterically and universally speaking, Demeter is the all-pervading spirit that is at the root of everything, or at the heart, if you prefer, the heart of everything in the material universe. However, we could also consider Demeter from an individual aspect as being the eternal spirit that casts its radiance upon all life, and which, having her foundation in the unknowable causeless cause, is omnipotent and omniscient. So again, it's the root of the universe, but it's also the heart of the individual. It is that which gives life and gives being to every human in existence, and in fact, beyond humanity, to everything in existence. So from understanding Demeter in this perspective, we can also look at Persephone, her daughter, as being the personified reincarnating ego. This undergoing a cyclic descent into matter and subsequent return to its original source through the processes of earthly and spiritual evolution. And I think we also find that many of these myths are incredibly dark and violent and deal with very uncomfortable themes. But perhaps this is to an extent to show how significant or how important or severe these themes are. It's almost as if to catch your attention in a way, and to prevent you from rejecting it. It's also to show that life is difficult, and it does contain many things which we find difficult or violent or uncomfortable to face. And it sort of expresses in the mythic retelling of this the idea that these things have a higher purpose. They're all part of a process, and at the root of this seeming absurdity and seeming pointlessness and seeming suffering of existence, at the root of this and at the heart of all of this, transcending and beyond this, is a purpose, is a reason, and that this reason in the end will shed light on the shadows of suffering. So I think when you consider this all in the light of theosophy, much which seems on the surface to be much which seems on the surface to be rather dark or forbidding or uncomfortable, is actually transformed by that light into something more universal. It's put into its place, and you see the relativity of suffering in the light of the whole. And so we will briefly retell this myth. So the abduction of Persephone, and here in the background, if you can see this, there is a very famous artistic representation of this abduction. So there's various forms of the myth. They're all essentially the same, so I'll give you a simplified version of it. If you would like to go back to some original sources, I can provide those. There's various translations, various versions of this myth. I can provide some recommendations on request. But essentially, according to the myth, Persephone was gathering flowers in a field when Hades, the god of the underworld, came to abduct her. Carrying her to his own realm, he married her with night as a witness, esoterically the uniting of the soul, Persephone, with the body, Hades. Persephone, appearing to Demeter in a mystic dream, begged her mother to rescue her, after which Demeter traversed the world in search for her daughter using the light of Hecate's torches. Yet no trace of her daughter was to be found. So even just in this introductory few paragraphs here, there's so much symbolism. There's so much to unravel and to dissect and to look at, isn't there? So obviously everything here has a variety of meaning. We see Persephone is gathering flowers in a field, clearly symbolic of life, the flourishing of life, when Hades, the god of the underworld, comes and drags her from this realm of life and flourishment and activity, takes her down to the underworld to the realm of materiality, of transience and baseness. And then we see this esoteric marriage, yes? It's a forced marriage, which I think is quite interesting as well. Obviously, Persephone didn't choose to marry Hades. It's sort of a forced marriage, the marriage between the soul and the body. So we see already here this idea of some sort of conflict, some sort of conflict between the spiritual and the material, and yet a necessary, although uncomfortable, unity of the two, uniting of the two. So we see, for example, to use a sort of very human example, in the sevenfold constitution, we have the idea of the higher and the lower mind and the perpetual conflict between the two, right? So our mind is constantly torn between things of a higher nature. We all have some aspirations towards the spiritual. This manifests differently in different people. It might be, for some people, a call to religion, to the religious life or the ascetic life. Other people, it might be a call to charity or service, that need, that yearning to help other people. In others, it might be in the deep appreciation of poetry, or through the study of science, where you discover the unity of things, the unity of life. All of these things perhaps coming from the spiritual nature. It's essentially, when we talk about that spiritual sense that everyone possesses in one form or another, whether very manifested or only very subtle, it's that understanding of universal brotherhood and primordial unity that transcends all differences. So that's there in everyone. But there's always a conflict between this and the needs of the lower self, the needs and the wants of the lower self. And so this manifests through the various ambitions that we have, the desires that we have, anything which is of a self-serving nature and comes from the lower mind, that doesn't benefit the whole, but rather serves to divide and differentiate and to separate and to create a difference between us and something else. All of this is inherently divisive, but it's also a part of our nature as human beings. And so this here is clearly what this is representing in this conflict. So the forced marriage of Persephone to Hades is in many ways rooted in conflict, rooted in something which is very unpleasant and uncomfortable. And we find this in our own life. We find in the bonding of the higher and the lower mind, there is a lot of conflict. And further in the bonding of the soul and the body, there is conflict, isn't there? And so while the process is necessary for our growth, there is conflict as a part of this also. And so we see here a reference to a dream, a mystic dream in which Persephone appears to her mother, a sort of vision. And obviously here we're dealing with very human themes. It's one thing I like about this myth is that it's so universal. You don't need to be an ancient Greek to feel for Demeter, to know how Demeter feels. It's something that not only every mother, but every human being can have a conception of and understand and relate to. So Demeter has lost her daughter. She's yearning for this, to be reunited and to find her daughter. And in her sorrow, she takes up Hecate's torches, the torches of illumination, to search for her daughter across all corners of the earth. So here is also an interesting esoteric message about the search, perhaps, for the higher self, right? And so in searching for the higher self, we often look in all the wrong places. Perhaps the corners of the earth might be the exoteric or outer shells of religion, the ceremonies, the forms, the traditions. While they can be useful, while they can assist us in living a spiritual life, they are not the essence of spirituality, are they? And so perhaps by shining our torches in the corners of the earth, or in the churches of our various religions and temples of our religions, we don't quite find what we are searching for. Rather, we need to bring the torches to the heart of the being, the heart of the self, which is the higher self. And so we find a sort of symbolic representation of the quest for the higher self here. And of course, as with all esoteric stories, there's not simply one interpretation which is the final and authoritative interpretation. All esoteric stories contain multiple shades of meaning, and this is absolutely intentional. It depends on where we are in our spiritual journey. While reading this, you might come up with a completely different interpretation, and that's absolutely okay, and that's absolutely valid, because we're all at different stages in our spiritual journeys and our spiritual evolution, and that's normal, and that's absolutely okay. And so these esoteric stories and mythology is designed in such a fantastic way that no matter where you are in the spiritual quest, that certain meaning speaks out to you, certain ideas speak to you. I think that's why myth is so universal and so essential to humanity. That's why story is so important. We all base much of our understanding of the world on stories, don't we? We hear stories from our parents, from our grandparents. We immerse ourselves in stories, and whether this be through books, through movies, through television. Although these things may come across as rather base, the stories contained in them are ancient and universal. Anyone familiar with Joseph Campbell's work on the matter, the sort of universality of these mythical figures, that, for example, the hero with 1,000 faces, that the hero in various stories, whether modern or ancient, is essentially the same hero and is an archetype, represents a certain aspect of ourselves. And so there's a reason why myths are structured the way they are, and they speak to us psychologically and spiritually on different levels. So you might take something else from this story, but I'm sure you'll take something from it, whether it is this interpretation that I am giving you from my own perspective, or whether it's a different interpretation. Both are absolutely valid in the study of Theosophy. And so we've had this separation of Demeter and Persephone. Persephone has been taken from her mother and has been forced into marriage by Hades, the god of the underworld. Demeter has searched for her daughter but failed to find her. And in her sorrow, Demeter neglected her duties to the earth, and nothing was grown nor produced. So she was the goddess of grain, right? The goddess of spring, and essentially Demeter's role in mythology, in Greek mythology, was to bring about the growing of plants and the fruitfulness of the earth. Okay, so she neglected her duties in her sorrow. Some interpreters see this as an intentional sort of a threat, if you like. You know, if a threat towards Zeus. If Zeus doesn't help her in finding her daughter, she will neglect her duties. She will fail to allow the plants to grow upon the earth, and therefore all humanity will die. And with humanity dying, there will be no one to offer sacrifices to the gods. So it's sort of a bit of a threat to Zeus in this interpretation. Or else, if you like the alternative interpretation, it was being drowned in her sorrow. Being drowned in her sorrow, she forgot her duties. And so occurred the first winter. So it's also a beautiful myth about the seasons. Exhausted and dispirited, Demeter rested on a stone. where she meditated for 9 days and 9 nights. This was, according to legend, the future site of the Eleusinian school. So this was in Eleusis. The 9 days and the 9 nights being the duration of the final initiations into the greater mysteries. Now, anyone here familiar with Norse mythology will clearly notice the similarity between the god Odin, the god of wisdom Odin, who hung on the tree. He hung upside down on the tree of wisdom for 9 days and 9 nights, didn't he? So he went through the same initiation, the same process of 9 days and 9 nights. And this number 9 is sacred, in particular in the mythologies of Greece, of the Norse mythology, and the Celtic mythology. So both the numbers 3 and 9, 9 being 3 times 3, so therefore being a very spiritual or symbolic number. And so we see that that was put into symbolic representation in the initiation mysteries, the initiation ceremonies of the final greater mysteries. And so finally, sort of at her wit's end, she's tried everything. She's sought all around the world. She's taken the life away from the earth, or she's withheld that life-giving presence that allows the plants to grow. Demeter finally approached Zeus to beg for the release of her daughter. So finally, we see Zeus relenting, granting permission for Persephone's return to the world of the living. However, there was a condition, and this is a very common theme in mythology. The condition was that she had not eaten any food during her time in the underworld. So I'd like to go into that a little bit more because it's such an interesting universal theme. The first time I heard about this idea of because this idea of descent into the underworld we find everywhere, right, in all mythologies. The first time I came across this idea of a descent into the underworld, and the idea that if you eat from the food from the underworld, you're unable to return to the world of the living, was in my own culture. We find in Celtic mythology the same theme, that if you happen to traverse into the world of the Fae, Fae being the Celtic word for fairy, the fairy folk. In the Norse, these were the elves, the elven folk, the elven people. If you happen to stumble into their world, and the curtain between the worlds is extremely thin, as you find especially in Celtic mythology, this idea that one may simply stumble into this world. It's very much, they speak of it almost as a common everyday experience, a common danger. That if you happen to traverse into this other world, you must not, under any circumstances, eat the food that is offered you. And we find this fascinating mythology surrounding Glastonbury. Glastonbury is a location in Somerset in England. It's an incredibly spiritual location. It's considered to be sacred both in the Christian tradition. There's all sorts of stories about the boy Jesus visiting Glastonbury with his uncle Joseph of Arimathea, and also in earlier pagan mythology. But there's all these ideas about people, oftentimes priests, who would walk upon the Tor, Glastonbury Tor, the hill, there's various times in the year when the veil between the worlds, the curtain between the worlds is thin, but in particular at Samhain, at Halloween, around this time in the harvest, where they would be walking upon the hill and suddenly find themselves in the other world, where they would be approached by all manner of beautiful people, beautiful fairies, who would bring them to a vast dining hall, where they would be encouraged to eat some of the delicious food placed upon the table. However, the myth always goes the same way, that if they eat the food from the table, they will be unable to return to the world of living and will therefore be forever tethered to the world of the dead, if you like, or the underworld or the other world. It depends on the particular myth. So it's exactly the same here, isn't it? It's interesting how these different cultures really interrelate. And so the condition was that she had not eaten any food during her time in the underworld. And I think we can all guess where this is heading. The problem was that Persephone had consumed a pomegranate, which Hades had given her, this preventing her complete release. So now we have a bit of an issue. Zeus has given his permission for her return, but she has consumed the food from the underworld and is therefore unable, she is physically unable to return to the world of the living, or Hades will not allow it, perhaps. And so a compromise was made, permitting Persephone to spend half of her time with her mother and the land of the living, and the other half with her husband, Hades. So I think there's so much we can take from this esoterically. We could see it partly as the soul's communion with its higher self during deep sleep and after death in both these states, while in its waking hours and the years of its earthly life are spent wedded to the body and its interests. And also, we see this clear process of reincarnation in this story, don't we? The coming into bodily form and the return to the realm of spirits. We also, and slightly less esoterically, this is also clearly an interpretation, clearly a mythical story regarding the seasons, isn't it? Winter and summer, day and night, just the polarity and the cyclicity of is contained in this. On the cosmic level, we could easily apply this to the periods of Manvantara and the periods of Pralaya. So you can sort of take this and apply it to the individual, to the microcosm, or to the universe, to the macrocosm. You can apply it wherever you like. And this works not only with this myth, but this applies to all myths. Because as we know from the Hermetic axiom, as above, so below, what applies to the high applies also to the low. So I think there's only a point in considering a principle if the principle is truly universal, isn't there? So in Theosophy, that's exactly what we attempt to do. We attempt to find the fundamental universal principles of existence. And one way to test the universality or the fundamentalism of a principle is to take it and to apply it to a variety of contexts and situations. If it's truly fundamental and universal, it should apply regardless of whether we are discussing the universe as a whole, the macrocosm, or the universe in miniature, man or humankind. It should apply on both levels equally to the nebula and the atom, if you like. So it's a very useful strategy, I think, in theosophic study. And so that concludes the myth. May come across as you may feel a little sorry for Persephone. She didn't quite get it's a bit of a glass half empty, half full sort of situation, isn't it, for Persephone there? But as we know, it's just an esoteric story whereby we can understand these universal principles. Okay, let's end by considering the purpose of the mysteries. Why did the initiates go through these various rites and traditions and initiations? So the overall aim of the mysteries was to free the soul, or to liberate the soul from the dominion of the flesh, or the bonds of the lower self. And we see a quote from Virgil. well, first of all, the neophyte to the neophyte was stressed the difficulty in achieving this goal. It's not a simple objective. It's not something that can be achieved without the proper aids, without the proper assistance. And so Virgil says, "Easy is the path that leads down to hell. Grim Pluto, here Hades, grim Hades' gate stands open night and day. But to retrace one's steps and escape to the upper regions, this is a work, this is a task." Virgil assures us, however, that despite the hardships, some few whom illustrious virtue advanced to heaven have effected it. So essentially, it's incredibly difficult but possible. It's the process of many lifetimes. Again, the purpose of reincarnation. It's not something achieved in the duration of a single lifetime. And we see also, easy is the path that leads down to hell. It's easy to be drawn down. It's easy to fall to the temptations of the lower nature, isn't it? We all know this. We all experience this. This is one of the big themes we find in the Upanishads and also in the Christian scriptures. The Christian scriptures are very focused on the idea of the temptations of the lower self and the dangers therein. And I think esoteric Christianity has a lot to say about that. Also in Gnosticism, we find a lot about this idea of the nature of the lower self to tempt and to bring us easily into contact with things which are detrimental to our spiritual development. Whereas to walk the upward path, to traverse the mountain of spiritual enlightenment, if you like, is the difficult journey. It is the narrow and tangled path, the path that only few may take. And so again, we see why the initiates are few in number. This is something which, while universal in the absolute sense, few people, few seekers are able to achieve at any one time, although we will all eventually surmount that great mountain of enlightenment. We will all eventually reach those heights. But in terms of any particular period, it is something that only a few very spiritually developed adepts or initiates or chelas may attain. And so I think we will briefly look at the process of the different initiations. And so, sorry, I'm just finding my notes. Right, so there were a variety of different initiation ceremonies. There seems to have been approximately five different initiation ceremonies, possibly more, possibly less. It's all, the scholarly research on the topic is incomplete, to use an understatement. The very little of it has come down to us. However, from our understanding, the first initiation was that of purification. Okay, so this was the process whereby the lower nature would be amended or purified, brought into communion with the higher self. The second was called the tradition of the mystery, in which the various mystery acts would be reenacted and symbolism would be taught. The third was known as inspection. I suppose this was a sort of period of trial period where under the careful watch of the masters or the higher initiates, the pupil would carry out a number of tasks and duties. The fourth was called the binding of the head and the fixing of the crowns, which Plato says is the equivalent of having the ability to lead others to knowledge. So in the fourth, you're reaching that period where you're beginning to pass on the knowledge to others or to assist the younger or less advanced pupils in this journey. The fifth and the greatest of the mystery rites, the most awe-inspiring of these rites, was described as friendship and communion with God. And Plato, interestingly, told us a bit about his own initiation. And he said that in his initiation, he found himself liberated from the body and united with his higher self. He said he became, in this moment, the spectator of blessed visions, resident in pure light. So he sort of experienced something perhaps akin to some of those near-death experiences. However, he wasn't going through a near-death experience, but perhaps similar in a sense, in that he experienced this transcendent unity and this all-pervading light. He was immersed in this ocean of light. Proclus also spoke a little bit about the interpretation of these visions that Plato experienced. He said that the gods in these visions exhibited themselves in many forms and appear in a variety of shapes. So again, we see that the primal forces of nature, or the universal principles which underlie nature, being personified as the gods that appear in visions and forms. And we certainly see in all cultures and all religions ideas of various gods appearing in mystic visions, don't we? Usually the gods attached to one's own particular culture, and we find this in studies, academic studies into near-death experiences. If you are Buddhist, you are very likely to encounter Buddha. If you are Christian, you are very likely to encounter Christ, and so on and so on. The philosopher Xenophon sort of jokingly stated that if a horse were to have a mystic vision, the horse would see a horse, a sort of a deified horse. So I think it is very true that we do create God in our own image, don't we? We take these universal principles and we clothe them in human form, but essentially these gods or these universal principles, they exist beyond the reach of, or beyond the images that we clothe them in. We simply try to relate to them on a personal level. And the only way to really relate is to put them into these myths and to put them into certain symbolic presentations. But interestingly, we'll find that when we consider the highest principle, when we consider para-Brahman, we don't have an image or a symbol or a personification of para-Brahman, the absolute. The absolute is beyond all image, beyond all form, beyond all symbolic representation. But these lower principles, it can be helpful, and obviously has been helpful to put them into symbolic form. So if there are self-conscious, sentient horses out there, I'm sure they have their own pantheons of horse gods and so on. So this obviously the human presentation and cultural presentations are connected to our own physical forms. And so this hopefully gives you a bit of an outline of the initiations. However, much like the other systems, well, actually, I'd say the one system that didn't decline was the Upanishadic tradition. The Upanishadic tradition is interesting in its continual passing down into the present day in essentially its unaltered form. So interestingly, that's why Hinduism is sometimes called the oldest religion, or the oldest religion in continuous existence, isn't it? So it still continues to this day, essentially how it was in ancient times. But we found with the Egyptians also, there was a decline and eventually a falling away of these ideas, and then they were cast into the realm of mythology, and other forms of philosophy and religion came to the forefront. Well, the same thing happened to the mystery schools of ancient Greece. And so around 510 BC, the states began to exploit the mysteries as a source of income through the implementation of a fee, a sort of entrance or tuition fee. So it was sort of monetized, and as as so often happens, greed got in the way of spiritual endeavors. And in so doing, a great occult law was broken that spiritual truths shall not be bought or sold, but are the common property of all humankind. We find that emphasized in all systems of occultism and in Theosophy and in Blavatsky's writings, that occultism shall not be sold, or these teachings, the ageless wisdom, shall not be sold. Um, this is not a system, this is not a sort of education in the ordinary sense either, is it? There should be no tuition fees as such, because this wisdom is already our common property. It's something that's essential to all of us. And so in the implementation of this fee, the Eleusinian school was profaned. Its mysteries reduced to base performances for the purposes of entertainment and profit. Until by the end of the 2nd century AD, anyone who paid the appropriate price could be initiated into the pseudo-mysteries. And I wish I had a reference for it. I don't right now, but I do know in Catholicism a few hundred years ago, there was something very similar that happened, where you could sort of pay off your priest for your sins. If you wish to commit an unforgivable sin, that's okay if you sort of paid the price for it. And this extended also to entrance into heaven. If you were able to pay enough, you could guarantee your entrance into heaven, and after that, sort of do as you will. But obviously, this is not a spiritual or an esoteric practice at all, and that you cannot buy enlightenment. And then, unfortunately, we also see this nowadays in some of the practices of certain gurus, both in India and around the world, or other spiritual teachers who like to sell their teachings or sell their techniques for spiritual enlightenment. But you cannot buy spirituality or enlightenment, and this is a fundamental law of occultism. And so over these 600 years during which the school degenerated further and further, the true initiates left, understanding that the school as a vehicle for the ageless wisdom had fulfilled its purpose and must now be abandoned. So, like I mentioned in the previous class, we see the cyclic rise and fall of various schools and religions. This is absolutely natural and fits into the plan of our evolution, our spiritual evolution, and the plan of the masters of wisdom. So there are periods where a certain culture or a certain school will be given the focus or the mission for the transmission of the ageless wisdom. And this is why we see the passing of the torch from India to Egypt to Greece. And this is very intentional, because the ageless wisdom must be passed to different cultures and take on different forms in order to be understood more widely by people from different cultures and from different periods. As our understanding of the world changes, so too must the form in which the ageless wisdom clothes itself. And so that's an interesting fact of the ageless wisdom. And so this wasn't the end, obviously, of the ancient wisdom. The initiates left, but they didn't simply scatter and scatter and hide, and that was the end of it. Rather, they would go on to found further schools and new groups and new organizations for the transmission of the teachings, which would eventually result in the Theosophical Society that we now belong to. And of course, the Theosophical Society is not the only vehicle for the transmission of the ageless wisdom teachings, but it is a significant one, and it is the one that the masters passed the torch onto at the end of the 19th century. And so there is a sort of positive message to take away from it, that although there are these periods of decline and degeneration, that's not important. That's just it's like the death of the body. The soul has already departed by the time that the body is in the earth and the body degenerates and rots. At that point, the soul has already departed. The form is non-important. The form is unimportant at that stage. So the form that was left behind in the last days of the Eleusinian school was simply a shell. The essence or soul of the teachings had already departed to other places, and the flame remained lit. The flame of the torch remained lit. And so in Isis Unveiled, H.P. Blavatsky stated that although the Greek epoche that the initiates are no more, we have now in our own age a people far more ancient than the oldest Hellenes, who practice the so-called preterhuman and superhuman gifts, to the same extent as did their ancestors far earlier than the days of Troy. So again, it's simply that it's non-important when one particular culture or school goes out of existence, because the flame continues and is passed on to the next. So we have exceeded our time. It's been a fascinating topic, I think. I have always been passionately interested in ancient Greece since my childhood, and I think there's so much in there to decipher and to take out and to understand in the light of Theosophy. So there may possibly be some questions from people who attended this class today. If so, I would be very happy to answer these questions.
Luke, thank you. That was amazing as usual. If anyone has any questions, you can ask a question in the chat room, or you can unmute yourself. We would love to hear your voices. So.
I'm not sure if anybody's speaking yet. I didn't want to interrupt. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
I just wanted to ask say thank you both and all of you so much again. Fantastic series. I wanted to ask about the eating of the fruit and the myth of Persephone and the eating of the apple in the Garden of Eden. I wanted to see if you could mention any of the, I don't know, similarities of that particular thing of eating the fruit that's descending into the physical world. Again, fantastic series. Thank you so much. Just wanted to see if you'd share on that.
That's a great question, and it's clearly the same story, isn't it? So if we consider the theme in both, we have the Garden of Eden, which is in some ways we see that the Garden of Eden is part of the world and yet apart from it. Okay, and so the Garden of Eden is a sort of heaven on earth, isn't it? It's guarded with the angel with the flaming sword. It's sort of guarded, and it's a beautiful paradise upon earth. The apple, I would suppose, is symbolic of the teva, the thing that bonds one to materiality. And so in taking the apple and eating of it, Eve bound herself to the material world. She became ensnared in the physicality of matter, exactly as did Persephone in eating the pomegranate. She sucked the juice from the pomegranate, if I recall the myth correctly. And so it's exactly the same myth, isn't it? I would say it's all about the soul, Eve, becoming bound in matter. Matter here being symbolized by the world outside of Eden. And so they are banished from Eden. They are banished from the spiritual realm to go into the physical plane. But upon death, return, interestingly, to return to heaven, don't they? So we see the Garden of Eden is simply a symbolic representation of heaven. The two are essentially the same. That was a very fascinating question. I love drawing those connections. In fact, it's a bit of an intellectual and spiritual exercise. If you take you come across these themes, maybe if you are well read in mythology, or if you enjoy examining different cultures and stories, look for these themes. Look for myths about fruits. Look for myths about trees. Look for myths in which a central character dies and then comes back, or descends into the underworld and returns to the world of the living. And I'm sure you'll find that these stories carry essential themes or ideas that interrelate to one another.
I have a question. Is it useful to read the Isis Unveiled?
Yes, certainly. If you're interested in this topic, Isis Unveiled goes into a lot more depth than we had time for in this class. So does the Secret Doctrine, but Isis Unveiled is particularly, some people have stated, some critics or well, reviewers, I should say, of HPB's works have sort of seen Isis Unveiled as the Western mysteries, the Western interpretation of Theosophy, and the Secret Doctrine as being the Eastern aspect of Theosophy. And it doesn't fit quite so neatly into those two categories. You do find references to the Eastern traditions in Isis Unveiled, and you do find references to, plenty of references to Western traditions in the two volumes of the Secret Doctrine. But if you're particularly interested in this, I think you will find a rich source of knowledge and wisdom in Isis Unveiled.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I was just wondering, you mentioned the 7 strings of Orpheus's lyre. Is that right? And sevenfold nature of humans, is this at all related? I'll have to read into this, to the 7 chakras, 7 aspects.
Certainly. Well, Theosophy postulates that not only the human being, but everything in existence, it consists of 7 aspects. And we talked about this a bit in our last class, but for the benefit of those who were not there, essentially, first of all, we need to build the relationship between the human being and the cosmos, because they are non-different in their essential nature. So everything that applies to the human being must also apply to the universe. Okay? So it's a universal principle. So the human being has 7 principles or planes of existence, sometimes referred to in theosophical literature as bodies. But these shouldn't be considered as bodies in the physical sense, as only the lower 2 are physical as such. The universe also contains 7 planes, and we find that the number 7 is a sacred number, which can be interpreted in a variety of ways. But yes, essentially the 7 stringed lyre refers to the 7 bodies of the human being, from the which range in density. We go from the physical body through the etheric body to the gradually higher and more subtle bodies, eventually resulting in the spiritual body, which is the higher self.
Yes, thank you.
Or the vehicle of the higher self, more properly. All right.
Okay, no more questions. We'll wrap it up. Luke, thank you so much. It was incredible, as usual. Thank you. Just absolutely amazing. Thank everyone for being here. You're a part of all of this, and we're so happy that you joined us. Next week is our 4th and last lecture. I can't believe it's over already. It went so fast. Luke is going to be talking about the ancient wisdom of the Celtic world, which he promises to talk about Stonehenge. He has a lot to say about Stonehenge. So that's going to be great. Please join us next week. Luke, thank you. as always.
Thank you,
Everyone,
Nancy.
thank you for joining us. Thank you for being here. And have a great day, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nancy, and thank you everyone for taking part. It's the participation of everyone from around the world that makes this work and makes this such a wonderful experience. So thank you everyone for being here, and I will see you all next week. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Bye.